What if I told you that the glittering royals who lived in magnificent palaces, wore jewels worth fortunes, and ruled entire empires, smelled absolutely terrible? Today we're diving into the disgusting, shocking, and downright stomach-turning hygiene habits of 16 British royal family members who would make you want to hold your breath if you ever met them. 1. Queen Elizabeth I. Queen Elizabeth I ruled England for 45 years and is remembered as one of the greatest monarchs in British history. But here's something they don't teach you in school. She was absolutely filthy. Elizabeth believed that bathing too frequently was dangerous and unhealthy. So how often did the Queen of England bathe? Once a month, whether she needed it or not. Yes, you heard that right. Once a month. But wait, it gets worse. Elizabeth was famous for her stark white face, which she achieved using thick lead-based makeup. This deadly cosmetic was applied every single day. But here's the truly disgusting part. She didn't wash off the previous day's layers before applying new makeup. Day after day, week after week, the makeup would build up on her skin, creating a toxic, crusty mask of filth and chemicals. Imagine meeting the Queen and seeing her face caked with weeks-old makeup, dirt, and lead poisoning, literally eating away at her skin underneath. Court members reported that you could smell her from across the room, despite the heavy perfume she wore to mask the odor. The lead in her makeup didn't just make her dirty, it poisoned her, causing hair loss and severe skin damage. Elizabeth's fear of water was so intense that her attendants had to practically force her into her monthly bath. She would complain the entire time, convinced that the water would make her sick. Ironically, the toxic makeup she refused to wash off was doing far more damage than a simple bath ever could. The Virgin Queen may have never married, but she was definitely married to filth. 2. King James I. If you thought Elizabeth I was bad, wait until you hear about King James VI. This monarch ruled Scotland and then England in the early 1600s, and he had one very peculiar hatred: water. James didn't just avoid bathing occasionally. He reportedly never bathed at all. Not once. Ever. Court records from the time describe James as having a powerful stench that would hit you the moment he entered a room. Courtiers and diplomats who had to meet with the king would prepare themselves mentally for the assault on their nostrils. But the smell wasn't even the worst part. James was absolutely infested with lice. These tiny parasites lived in his hair, his beard, and his clothing, and the king seemed completely unbothered by them. His attendants complained constantly about having to deal with his vermin-infested garments, but James saw no reason to change his ways. Even at mealtimes, when you'd think basic hygiene would be important, the king refused to properly wash his hands. He would simply dab at them with a napkin and call it good enough. Imagine eating a royal feast prepared by the finest chefs in the kingdom, while the king sitting across from you is crawling with lice and hasn't washed his hands. Foreign ambassadors wrote letters back to their home countries expressing shock and disgust at the English king's personal habits. Some historians believe James's aversion to water stemmed from a traumatic childhood experience, but whatever the reason, it made him one of the filthiest monarchs to ever sit on the British throne. The man united Scotland and England under one crown, but he couldn't unite himself with a bar of soap. 3. King Henry VIII. King Henry VIII is famous for having 6 wives, breaking with the Catholic Church, and being one of England's most powerful monarchs. But let me tell you about a side of Henry that definitely doesn't make it into the history books: his absolutely revolting personal hygiene. Despite living in lavish palaces, Henry VIII rarely changed his undergarments. Yes, the same underwear, day after day, week after week. Can you imagine the smell? His servants certainly could. To make matters worse, Henry slept in a bed filled with furs, which sounds luxurious until you realize those furs attracted fleas, lice, and all manner of pests. Every night, the King of England shared his bed with hundreds of tiny biting insects. Henry did bathe occasionally, but not with water and soap like we do today. Instead, he used perfumed water that was more about masking odors than actually cleaning anything. It was like spraying cologne on garbage. It might smell better for a few minutes, but the underlying filth is still there. As Henry grew older and more obese, his hygiene problems only got worse. He developed painful ulcers on his legs that oozed pus and added to his already overwhelming stench. Court members would burn incense and scatter herbs on the floor when the king was expected to appear, desperately trying to mask his odor. Some historians believe Henry's infamous anger and cruelty might have been partially due to the constant discomfort of living in such filthy conditions. His later wives, particularly Catherine Howard and Catherine Parr, must have needed iron stomachs to fulfill their wifely duties. Henry VIII wanted to be seen as a magnificent king, but up close, he was magnificently disgusting. 4. Edward VI became King of England when he was just 9 years old, and he died at only 15. In his short reign, hygiene was absolutely not a priority. You might think a young king would be more concerned with cleanliness than his elders, but Edward was very much a product of his time, and his time was filthy. One bizarre practice at Edward's court was that his clothes had to be tested on servants first because everyone was paranoid about poison. Someone else would literally wear his garments before Edward did to make sure they weren't laced with deadly toxins. But here's the ironic thing. This did absolutely nothing for cleanliness. So while Edward's clothes were poison-free, they were still crawling with who knows what. The young king was more focused on religious reform and studying than on personal care. His tutors and advisors never emphasized hygiene, viewing it as relatively unimportant compared to education and piety. Edward's chambers were cleaned irregularly, and his personal care was minimal at best. Like most Tudor royals, he believed that bathing too much could make you sick by opening your pores to disease. Historical accounts describe Edward as pale and sickly, which isn't surprising given the conditions he lived in. When he developed tuberculosis, the filthy environment he inhabited certainly didn't help his chances of recovery. The boy king's living quarters, despite being in a palace, were probably less sanitary than many modern college dorm rooms. Edward died young and was never able to develop the reputation for filth that some of his relatives achieved. But make no mistake, he was living in absolute squalor by our standards. It's tragic to think about a child growing up in such conditions, even if he were a king. 5. Mary, Queen of Scots. Mary, Queen of Scots, led one of the most dramatic lives in royal history. She was Queen of Scotland, briefly Queen of France, and a prisoner in England for nearly 2 decades before her execution. But during all this drama, personal hygiene was often the last thing on anyone's mind, especially Mary's. For much of her life, Mary was sequestered, either locked away in castles or imprisoned by her cousin, Queen Elizabeth I. During these long periods of confinement, her access to basic hygiene resources was severely limited. But even when she had the opportunity to maintain better cleanliness, Mary's hygiene was considered poor even by the low standards of the 16th century. Historical records include complaints from people who visited Mary's chambers about the unpleasant odors that greeted them. Some accounts suggest that the smell was so bad that visitors would try to keep their meetings as brief as possible. During her imprisonment, Mary's captors occasionally commented on the state of her personal cleanliness, though whether they were exaggerating for political reasons is debatable. The Scottish Queen had many talents. She was intelligent, spoke multiple languages, and was an accomplished musician, but cleanliness wasn't among her priorities. Part of this might have been due to her Catholic faith and the belief that physical suffering and discomfort were paths to spiritual purity. Whatever the reason, Mary's personal hygiene became yet another unfortunate aspect of her tragic life. When Mary was finally executed in 1587, some accounts mention that her executioners were taken aback by the state of her person. After nearly 20 years of imprisonment and a lifetime of minimal hygiene, the once beautiful queen had become a shadow of her former self, and a rather smelly shadow at that. 6. Queen. Victoria Queen. Victoria ruled the British Empire for over 63 years, oversaw tremendous technological and social progress, and gave her name to an entire era. But here's something that might shock you. Despite living during a time when attitudes toward hygiene were slowly improving, Victoria was terrified of bathing. The Victorian era brought many advances in sanitation and public health, but Queen Victoria herself was stuck in old superstitions. She genuinely believed that bathing could cause serious illness or even death. In her mind, exposing your body to water and removing its natural protective layers made you vulnerable to disease. This wasn't entirely unreasonable for someone born in 1819, when medical knowledge was still quite limited, but Victoria clung to these beliefs long after they'd been disproven. Her hygiene rituals were considered insufficient, even by the standards of her own time. While she did wash, it was minimal and infrequent. Victoria preferred to use dry methods of cleaning, like brushing her clothes and hair, rather than actually bathing. She relied heavily on perfumes, powders, and frequent changes of clothing to maintain an appearance of cleanliness without actually being clean. Members of her household staff occasionally commented in their private letters about the Queen's reluctance to bathe properly. Some historians suggest that after Prince Albert's death in 1861, Victoria's hygiene deteriorated even further as she sank into deep mourning and depression. The Queen, who was supposed to represent the height of civilization and progress, was, in reality, avoiding one of its most basic practices. 7. Queen Anne. Queen Anne ruled Britain from 1702 to 1714, but her reign was marked by constant illness and physical suffering. Unfortunately, this chronic poor health meant that Anne's personal hygiene was absolutely terrible. She simply couldn't maintain any kind of regular cleanliness routine because she was too sick. "So I seem too weak or in too much pain." Anne suffered from what historians believe was gout, arthritis, and possibly lupus. She was frequently bedridden and in agony. By the end of her life, she was so large and immobile that she had to be lifted by machinery. In these conditions, regular bathing was essentially impossible. Anne rarely changed her garments because the process of undressing and redressing was too painful for her swollen, aching joints. Instead of dealing with the ordeal of bathing, Queen Anne relied heavily on perfume to mask her personal odor. Servants would douse her in scented oils and waters, but this was like putting a band-aid on a bullet wound. It didn't really solve the problem. Court members who had to spend time near the Queen would later write about the overwhelming combination of perfume and body odor that surrounded her. The tragedy of Queen Anne's situation is that her poor hygiene wasn't really her fault. She was genuinely suffering and doing the best she could under incredibly difficult circumstances. However, that didn't make her smell any better. Imagine being a diplomat meeting with the Queen of Great Britain and having to maintain a straight face while the stench nearly knocks you over. Anne's hygiene problems became so well known that political opponents sometimes used them in propaganda, portraying her as unfit to rule. It was cruel, but in the cutthroat world of 18th century politics, nothing was off limits, not even the Queen's inability to take a bath. 8. George III, King. George III is famous for two things: losing the American colonies and going mad. But here's something else you should know about Mad King George. He had completely bizarre ideas about cleanliness that actually made him less clean, not more. George III was known for his eccentric cleanliness rituals. He would obsess over certain aspects of personal care, like arranging his wigs just so, or insisting his clothes be prepared in specific ways. You'd think all this fussiness would make him clean, right? Wrong. Despite all these rituals, George actively avoided actual bathing because he believed it was dangerous and unhealthy. The king was convinced that submerging your body in water could kill you or make you seriously ill. So instead of bathing, he would engage in elaborate cleaning routines that didn't involve water, brushing his clothes, powdering his wigs, and dabbing at his skin with dry cloths. To anyone watching, it might have looked like he was maintaining good hygiene, but in reality, he was just rearranging the dirt. As George's mental illness progressed, his hygiene habits became even stranger. He would sometimes go through phases of refusing to let anyone touch him, which meant no one could help him clean himself. Other times, he would insist on washing only specific parts of his body while ignoring the rest. His attendants and doctors were at a loss for how to deal with these peculiarities. Historical accounts from his periods of madness describe George as disheveled and malodorous, a far cry from the dignified monarch he had once been. It's sad to think about how mental illness, combined with poor hygiene practices, made his later years even more difficult. George III's story reminds us that you can have all the cleaning rituals in the world, but if they don't involve actual soap and water, you're still going to smell. 9. King William IV had an unusual background for a British monarch. He spent his youth in the Royal Navy, rising to the rank of admiral. You'd think someone with a military background would value cleanliness and order, but William's living quarters tell a very different story. They were absolutely disgusting. Before becoming king in 1830, William lived a relatively informal life compared to other royals, but informal apparently meant filthy in William's case. Palace staff who served him documented the shocking state of his living quarters. We're talking about rooms that hadn't been properly cleaned in months, with dirt, dust, and who knows what accumulating in every corner. Even after becoming king, William maintained these filthy habits. He was known as the Sailor King for his naval background, and apparently he brought the grimy conditions of a 19th century ship to Buckingham Palace. Staff members would later write in their diaries about the challenge of trying to clean the king's quarters, only to have him complain and undo their work because he'd grown comfortable with the mess. William wasn't particularly concerned with appearances or protocol, which was refreshing in some ways, but disgusting in others. He would receive important visitors in rooms that hadn't been aired out in weeks, sit on furniture covered in stains, and generally maintain a standard of living that was shockingly low for a monarch. Some historians suggest that William's time at sea, where cleanliness was often impossible, had permanently lowered his standards. The Sailor King's reign only lasted 7 years, but that was 7 years of palace staff struggling to maintain any semblance of cleanliness in his presence. When he died in 1837, his niece Victoria took over, and one of her first acts was to order a thorough deep cleaning of the royal residences. They definitely needed it. 10. Queen Caroline. Now we come to perhaps the most shocking entry on our list. Queen Caroline, wife of King George IV. This woman's hygiene was so notoriously bad that it became a matter of public record. Yes, Parliament, the government of Britain, actually documented complaints about how terrible she smelled. Caroline of Brunswick married the future George IV in 1795, and it was a disaster from day one. George claimed he needed to drink brandy just to get through the wedding ceremony because Caroline smelled so bad. While George himself was no prize in the hygiene department, we'll get to him soon, even he was repulsed by his wife's odor. Multiple sources from the time described Caroline's smell as overwhelming and inescapable. Guests at royal functions would literally avoid sitting near her because the stench was so powerful. Some accounts claim you could smell her coming from the next room. The queen apparently never saw any reason to bathe regularly, change her undergarments frequently, or take any of the basic steps necessary to avoid becoming a walking biohazard. When George IV tried to divorce Caroline, one of the accusations used against her, in official parliamentary proceedings, was her shocking lack of personal hygiene. Imagine being so smelly that it becomes part of your divorce trial. Documents from the House of Lords include testimony from servants and courtiers describing Caroline's filthy habits and unbearable odor. Caroline's poor hygiene became fodder for political cartoons and public gossip. The people of England were divided on whether to support her or her equally despicable husband. But everyone agreed on one thing: the Queen of England stank. It's almost impressive that someone could be so consistently filthy that it would be remembered throughout history. Queen Caroline definitely earned her spot on this list. 11. Queen Isabella I of Spain. Okay, I know this list is supposed to be about British royals, but we have to include Queen Isabella I of Spain because her hygiene story is absolutely legendary and had major connections to British history. Plus, she set such a low bar for royal cleanliness that she influenced hygiene standards across all of European royalty. Isabella supposedly bathed only twice in her entire life, once at birth, which doesn't really count because someone else bathed her, and once before her wedding. That's it. One bath in 70 years of life. Let that sink in for a moment. This woman financed Christopher Columbus's voyage to the Americas, completed the Reconquista of Spain, and established one of the most powerful dynasties in European history, all while being absolutely filthy. Legend has it that Isabella made a vow not to bathe until a military campaign was successful. The campaign took 3 years. Can you imagine not bathing for 3 years? By the time she finally washed, historians suggest the water probably turned solid brown instantly. Some versions of the story claim she actually vowed not to change her undergarments, which is somehow even worse. Isabella's attitude toward hygiene influenced Spanish royalty for generations and, through marriages between royal families, affected British royals too. Several British monarchs married into Spanish royal lines that traced back to Isabella, bringing with them her casual attitude toward personal cleanliness. It's like a family tradition, except instead of passing down jewelry or titles, they were passing down body odor. 12. Catherine de' Medici. Catherine de' Medici was an Italian princess who became Queen of France, but her hygiene philosophy influenced British royalty through family connections and the general attitudes of European nobility. Catherine had a fascinating but absolutely disgusting approach to cleanliness. She believed water could kill you, so she used perfume instead. In Catherine's mind, water was dangerous. She thought bathing opened your pores and allowed diseases to enter your body. This wasn't an uncommon belief in the 16th century, but Catherine took it to extremes. Instead of washing with water, she would douse herself in perfume, oils, and scented powders. It was like she was marinating in cologne rather than actually getting clean. Catherine was obsessed with perfumes and cosmetics. She brought Italian perfume makers to France and revolutionized the perfume industry there. But here's the thing. She wasn't using perfume as a pleasant addition to cleanliness. She was using it as a substitute. No amount of rose water or lavender oil can replace an actual bath, but Catherine never got that memo. The French court under Catherine became famous for its overpowering scents. Everyone was wearing heavy perfumes to mask their body odor, and the combination of dozens of unwashed people all wearing different strong scents must have been absolutely nauseating. Visitors from other countries would comment on the strange smell of the French court. Not quite bad, not quite good, just overwhelming and artificial. Catherine's fear of water and reliance on perfume spread throughout European royal courts. British nobles who visited France or married into French families brought these ideas back with them. Some historians argue that Catherine de' Medici's influence helped extend the period of poor hygiene among European royalty by making perfume seem like an acceptable alternative to actual cleanliness. Thanks for nothing, Catherine. 13. Queen Mary. Bloody Mary, Queen Mary Wifst, known as Bloody Mary for her persecution of Protestants, ruled England from 1553 to 1558. While history remembers her for religious violence, we should also remember her for being absolutely filthy. There are no historical records of Mary maintaining any kind of regular bathing schedule, and numerous accounts describe the generally disgusting state of her court. Mary lived during the Tudor period when hygiene standards were at an all-time low, but even by Tudor standards, things were pretty grim. The royal court was infested with lice and fleas. These parasites were so common that courtiers would casually pick them off each other during meetings as if it were completely normal. Spoiler alert, it shouldn't have been normal. Mary herself was frequently ill, suffering from what historians believe were stress-related conditions, phantom pregnancies, and possibly ovarian cancer. Her poor health was likely made worse by the filthy conditions in which she lived. Unwashed bodies, unchanged bedding, and unclean living spaces are breeding grounds for disease, and Mary's court had all three in abundance. Reports from foreign ambassadors describe the overwhelming smell of Mary's court. One Spanish diplomat wrote that he could barely stand to be in the same room as the Queen and her ladies for extended periods because of the odor. Remember, this is coming from someone who lived in the 16th century when everyone smelled bad. So for him to comment on it means it must have been really terrible. Mary's focus on religious reform and her desperate desire for an heir meant that personal hygiene was nowhere on her priority list. She was too busy burning heretics and trying to restore Catholicism to England to worry about little things like bathing or changing her clothes. Bloody Mary might have washed away Protestant heresy, but she definitely didn't wash away her own stench. 14. Queen Jane Seymour. Jane Seymour, Henry VIII's third wife and the only one who gave him a son, is often portrayed as the good wife in the dramatic story of Henry's marriages. But being a good wife in Tudor England meant living in absolutely disgusting conditions, and Jane was no exception to the rule of royal filth. Jane became queen in 1536 and lived in Hampton Court Palace, which sounds glamorous until you learn about the reality of Tudor palaces. These buildings were infested with vermin. We're talking about rats in the walls, mice running across floors, and worst of all, lice and fleas absolutely everywhere. These parasites lived in people's hair, clothes, bedding, and even the tapestries hanging on the walls. Court records from Jane's time describe frequent infestations and the constant battle against these pests. But here's the thing. People didn't understand that cleanliness could actually help prevent these infestations. They thought lice and fleas were just a natural part of life that you had to accept. So instead of bathing more and washing clothes regularly, they would just accept being itchy and uncomfortable all the time. Jane Seymour died just 12 days after giving birth to Edward VI, likely from puerperal fever, an infection that was extremely common at the time. While we can't know for certain, the unsanitary conditions of the Tudor court definitely didn't help. Childbirth in a filthy palace with unwashed attendants and dirty linens was basically a death sentence for many women, and Jane tragically became one of them. During her brief time as queen, Jane would have been crawling with lice just like everyone else at court. She might have been Henry VIII's favorite wife, but she was also his itchiest. The Tudor court was a place where you could be surrounded by gold, jewels, and silk, while simultaneously being eaten alive by parasites. 15. Charles II. Charles II is known as the Merry Monarch for restoring fun and entertainment to England after the grim years of Puritan rule. His court was famous for parties, plays, and general debauchery. But there was nothing merry about the smell of Charles's gatherings. They were absolutely rank. Court records from the Restoration period describe the extreme smells at Charles II's social events. Imagine being invited to a royal party. You're excited, you get all dressed up, you arrive at the palace, and you're hit by a wall of stench so powerful it makes your eyes water. That was the reality of Charles's court. Dozens or hundreds of unwashed people, all wearing heavy perfumes crammed into poorly ventilated rooms, eating rich food, and drinking heavily. The smell must have been indescribable. Charles himself wasn't particularly clean, despite having access to the best facilities and servants in England. He kept numerous mistresses, and some accounts suggest that even they complained about the sanitary conditions at court. When your lovers are making comments about the smell, you know you've got a problem. The king's living spaces and party venues maintained poor sanitary conditions throughout his reign. Waste wasn't properly disposed of, floors weren't regularly cleaned, and the general atmosphere was one of celebration first and cleanliness never. Some historians argue that the reaction against Puritan austerity went too far in the opposite direction, leading to excess in every area, including excess filth. 16. Queen Henrietta Maria. Queen Henrietta Maria was the French-born wife of Charles I and mother of Charles II. She brought many French customs to the English court, including, unfortunately, the French royal aversion to bathing. Henrietta Maria followed the typical French royal philosophy of the time. Why use water when you have perfume? The queen relied heavily on scented oils, perfumes, and powders to maintain an appearance of cleanliness without ever actually being clean. She would layer perfume upon perfume, creating a cloud of overwhelming scent that announced her presence before she even entered a room. Some courtiers found this preferable to actual body odor, but many found the combination of perfume and underlying stench to be even worse than simple filth would have been. Staff members who served Henrietta Maria privately complained about her hygiene habits in their letters and diaries. She rarely bathed, changed her undergarments infrequently, and seemed genuinely puzzled when people suggested more regular washing. In her mind, she was clean because she used perfume. The fact that perfume only masks odor rather than eliminating it never seemed to occur to her. During the English Civil War, Henrietta Maria fled to France and then back to England multiple times. The stress of war and constant travel meant her hygiene declined even further. Observers noted that the queen became increasingly disheveled and malodorous as the political situation deteriorated. When your country is falling apart, bathing probably seems like a low priority, but that doesn't make you smell any better. Henrietta Maria's influence on English court culture included introducing more elaborate perfume use, which might sound elegant until you realize it was being used to cover up the fact that nobody was bathing. She helped establish the tradition of royal filth disguised by expensive scents, a tradition that would continue for generations. Talk about leaving your mark on history. If you enjoyed this disgusting dive into royal history, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment telling me which royal's hygiene shocked you the most. And don't forget to hit that notification bell so you never miss another fascinating history video.